Sorry, I don't think you can hear me. Can you hear me now? Yes. I would like you to share with me an applause to welcome General John Allen.
Great to see you.
Thank you so much.
It's a pleasure.
Good afternoon, Your Excellency, Madam President, ladies and gentlemen. I would very much like to tell you how proud I am and privileged to be sharing a stage with a wealth of information about the subject we will be discussing today. I think you all know who the general is, who has served in many, many places, including Iraq, Afghanistan, and of course, as the special advisor to President Obama and a special envoy, I should say, on global coalition to counter ISIS. So I'm sure you all have many questions for the general. I do. And what better else to start with than really discussing and knowing who's ISIS, Daesh, Fahish, whatever you want to call them. In the States, of course, they call them Isil. So I'm going to directly ask General Allen to start with the beginnings of Daesh. Who's Daesh? Who created them? How come we have them? Are they a product of Syria and Iran? Are they ex-Saddam Hussein? Did they just come out of frustration? General, I have many questions for you. Can we start with this one?
Sure. First, thanks very much for letting me share the stage with you. Two very brief comments. I thought the German Minister of Defense's speech was excellent, and the answers to her questions were as well. Set the context, I think, for a lot of important discussion in this conference. Second thing I would ask, it's a favor to ask of the folks in this room today. The room is full of people who are important. And if you get a chance, this is my fourth GLOBSEC, and I've had the chance now to spend a bit of time and get to know some of the folks involved here. If you get a chance, take a moment and just take a second to thank the people wearing the green lanyards, the young women and men. There's about 100 of them at least who have put this together and make it run smoothly. And I'll tell you why. Because I predict that in that group, there is probably at least one president in the future, probably some prime ministers and other ministers, key national leaders. And they're doing a great job in supporting this, and I would ask that you take just a moment and thank them, or take a moment and introduce yourselves to them, please.
General, will you allow me to also add the people who are wearing the blue, who are the organizers, and there's only 20 of them.
Oh, good.
So again, thank you very much.
Yes, thank you. The question you've asked is a complex question because it depends on where history starts in this conversation. Daesh, as we know it today, is a lineal descendant of an organization that many of us in this room had the chance to fight in Iraq, called Al-Qaeda in Iraq, AQI. So this organization is well over a decade old. It was prominent at the time by a leader who most of us have heard the name of before, Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, who met his end in 2006. The organization would continue under a series of leaders, but eventually would migrate out of Iraq into Syria, taking advantage of the chaos of the Syrian civil war, where a leader would emerge known as Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. And he led the organization in Syria during the civil war as part of an organization, an Al-Qaeda organization called Jabhat al-Nusra. If you can imagine it, Jabhat al-Nusra would eventually expel the so-called Islamic State because of the horrific acts that it meted out to the people that it would subjugate and capture. That began a sequence of events in 2013, which we'll call in a military context what we call advanced force operations, where elements of the Islamic State began a systematic infiltration of Iraq. systematic preparation of Iraq for an invasion which would come in 2014. And by the end of 2013, no less a city as the city of Fallujah was in the hands of Daesh, which for me and folks like me, seeing the black flag of Daesh flying over combat outposts that we fought for during the war was a pretty grim experience.
Where people are dying from starvation now, General.
That's right. It's a terrible place. It's surrounded now and contained, but for those who remain in Fallujah, it's a very terrible environment. In the late spring of 14, Daesh came out of Syria in full bloom in a conventional conflict. I think we all know the history at that point where Mosul fell. The KRG, the Kurdistan Regional Government, was threatened briefly, but the great courage of the Peshmerga and the Kurds themselves, supported by the international community, staved off disaster in Erbil. But sadly, the Yazidis went down hard under Daesh's boot. And they headed for Baghdad, promising to eliminate all of the holy sites of the Shia, which prompted an intervention by Iran to try to stave this off. And at that point, the United States and our partners, in conjunction with the attack on Erbil, intervened. Coalition was formed, and today Daesh really exists in three parts. There's three components, and it's important to take a second with this. The first is what we call core Isil. Core Isil is that portion that exists in the geographic region of Iraq and Syria, and that portion of Isil is under a lot of pressure. And I won't take you through the statistics. We can talk about it in questions and answers, but it is shrinking. It is shrinking both in its surface area. It is shrinking in terms of the numbers of people it controls. It's shrinking in its leadership because we're directly targeting the leadership throughout the entire surface area. The second part of Isil, and this, by the way, this metamorphosis occurred in the latter part of 14 and early 15. The second part of Isil is in the context of it now being a so-called caliphate. By virtue of the doctrine of being a caliphate, it has to be in relentless attack against the apostates and the unbelievers, us. And to do so, it has to always be gaining ground and gaining population over which it controls. This created a sequence of events in 14 and 15, and is still going on. Just yesterday, in fact, another aspect occurred, where contained insurgencies and criminal networks around the world began to put their hands in the air to become part of this caliphate. And the central Daesh organization in Raqqa would vet them and then designate them a distant province or a wilayat. The numbers vary on how many there are today, somewhere between probably 10 to 12. There's one in Libya, for example. It's made it very difficult for a solution in the Libyan war. Boko Haram is the wilayat of West Africa, and Sarbet al-Maqdis in the Sinai is the wilayat of Sinai. And it goes on, and it heads east. And I just flew in from New Zealand and Australia, where I was speaking with our counterparts out there about their concern about the wilayat that is emerging in Southeast Asia. And just on the 13th, there was a declaration by Raqqa that their brothers of the former organization called the Abu Sayyaf in the Mindanao in the Philippines is now a wilayat. So what we're seeing is the emergence of a group that is tied to the center, and that's the second component. The third component, the one that worries me the most, is the global network that operationalizes the connection between the center, the core, and the constellation of provinces. And this network does several things. It provides command and control. It provides for the movement of fighters and materiel and money. And very importantly, it provides for a unity of message.
How serious is their presence in Libya, General?
Oh, it's very serious. It's, in fact, it has been one of the great impediments, frankly, to moving towards a political solution in Libya.
Sure.
And it's wherever it is, it originally was a difficulty in any case, but now globally networked, we have the potential for some real capacity there. And this is the network that's facilitated the attacks in Europe. This is the network that will facilitate attacks later. And if we don't think that this is very important, I would contend that Daesh is probably in a strategic counterattack right now.
Sure. I just would like to remind the audience that I would like to take questions from you, and whoever would like to also post a question, I'd like to accommodate as many questions as possible. Can we start with Dr. Ibtisam from Abu Dhabi, please? Microphone here, please.
Thank you, Baria. Thank you, General. I'm heading a think tank called Emirates Policy Center, and we are dealing with ISIS. And our latest publication, it's about the root of terrorist group, both Sunni and Shia.
Mm-hmm.
General Allen, my comment is ISIS is an outcome of two failures of US administration. Bush administration, invasion of Iraq, creating the vacuum for the terrorist group, and Obama's hesitance to solve Syrian crisis, creating a vacuum for ISIS. And you were watching ISIS coming through Turkish border. At that time, nobody is taking any action, just watching until the dilemma.
Can I ask you for a question,
yeah,
please?
You are mentioning that ISIS is shrinking. I believe ISIS is ideology. It's not just a group. Now, it's not just fighting with a weapon. You need another ideology because you have those ISIS coming from democratic country.
Dr. Ibtisam, do you have a question?
No, this is when he said
Thank
it's
you.
shrinking. Do you believe that ISIS is shrinking?
I made the point that ISIS surface area is shrinking. I also made the point that in its organization today, it has a unified message, which is a real threat. But let's make sure that we're clear on this issue. We can blame the United States all we want to for this problem. One of the great problems is the failed governance in that region. The failed governance, one state after another, that has failed to deliver on the promise of governance for its people. Lack of inclusion, lack of economic opportunity, lack of access to education, lack of rights for women. Let's make sure that we're very clear that the conditions which conceivably might have been lit off by a U.S. involvement in the region, those conditions were long-standing, and they were the conditions as a result of a widespread failure of governance in that region, perhaps even the collapse of the Arab government process. So we got to be realistic with ourselves. We have to be honest with ourselves as what this issue is. And let me just make an important point. The United States is, and many of the countries in here, spends a lot of time talking about countering violent extremism. I happen to think that that's the wrong term to use. If we're countering violent extremism, we're already late. We should be countering extremism, and we should be seeking to get to the left of radicalization, because the conditions of the region have created such a widespread disenfranchisement of so many of the people, the young women and the men in those populations who have no future, no hope of a future because their government is not interested in incorporating them into the future, that widespread radicalization creates a vibrant reservoir for recruitment into organizations like Daesh, like Al-Qaeda, like Jemaah Islamiyah, like Abu Sayyaf. All of those groups benefit from failed governance and failed opportunity. So I will give you the fact that the invasion of Iraq, in fact, set loose a series of operations or a set of conditions which we have to live with today. But those conditions were long-standing conditions, and they are the result of an absence of capacity in those governments, both to govern but also the willingness to govern. And we have to recognize that, and we have to face it honestly. Because the solution isn't to constantly go back to the history of the United States invasion of Iraq. The solution is a generational effort on our part to change those underlying economic, political, economic, or educational conditions that give rise to that large an organization. We're going to be fighting Daesh forever unless we fundamentally change the conditions in the region. And this is what our challenge ought to be. This is where Europe and the United States and the region ought to be working together. And the defense minister of Germany, I thought, hit it right on the head.
I think the general is absolutely right in the sense that this is a very complicated, I think this needs a session on its own, so hopefully we'll have time sometime. Can I ask Sir John Jenkins to come up?
John Jenkins, International Institute for Strategic Studies.
John, good to see you.
We were talking about Daesh when we last met in Tel Aviv back in January. And I think Daesh can be defeated militarily. The question is,
Right.
what then? Yesterday, or a few days ago, there was a combined Saudi-Emirati operation to take back the principal town in Lahej in Yemen from Al-Qaeda-associated forces. And the Saudis, of course, have put together this essentially it's an anti-Daesh coalition, or they're seeking to do this. In the end...
It's not Daesh. In Yemen?
No, not in Yemen, no. Yemen is Al-Qaeda.
Can we come to the question as quickly as
the question
we
is this. It's only in the region that this can be defeated in the longer term. It's only people in the region who can defeat this. How do we work, and this follows on what you were saying, how do we work with countries like Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, and others who see this as a more poisonous threat to them and to us, to deal with this in the longer term?
Of course, more people are dying from Daesh in the region than anywhere else in the world, so...
I would also contend that more people are dying from the Bashar al-Assad regime in
Yes,
the,
true.
in the region
Absolutely,
than from Daesh
yes.
by orders
True.
of magnitude.
Yes.
John, your question is important, and I think King Abdullah of Jordan answered it very well at one point. He said, this is a fight for the future of our faith. And to the point that was made from the lady from the Emirates, this is about an idea. And King Abdullah said that we have to defeat the idea. We might defeat them in the physical sphere, and we're doing that now, and we will eventually defeat them in the physical sphere. But unless we kill the idea of Daesh, we cannot truly defeat it. So his point would be, in the Middle East, for example, it should have an Arab face and a Muslim voice. And we have talked with our partners in Southeast Asia, where we're beginning to see a wilayat form in Southeast Asia. And our friends in Malaysia, for example, have said that they're willing to throw in the context of a messaging center. The Emirates has created a messaging center called the Sawab Center, which is a very powerful counter to Daesh's message. So very pleased and proud of the work that the Emirates has done in this regard. And Malaysia is talking about a center that has a Southeast Asian face and a Muslim voice. The leadership in Nigeria have talked about one similarly in Nigeria, which would give us an African face and a Muslim voice. It's important that the voice or that the message is countered by the regions that are involved. We can't have a single strategic message. We can create strategic guidelines, but the dissemination of the message itself has to be local, it has to be regional, it has to be culturally relevant and culturally acceptable. And that's the challenge for us. Of the many things associated with the strategy, which is a military strategy and a counter-finance, counter-foreign fighters, counter-stabilization, the hardest one of all of them is the counter-messaging campaign, because getting organized to fight the idea of Daesh has been the greatest challenge, I think, of the strategy. No, we're not doing enough, but I think we're organizing now in the way that can grip this. The fact that Daesh has become a global network, I think, has complicated that.
I think I need to ask a question from the people who are writing, and then I'll come back to the floor. To what extent, General, do you think Russia's military intervention in Syria weakens ISIS? What can the anti-ISIS coalition learn from Russia's operation in Syria? And that's a question from Andrea Bogadovinsky. Sorry, excuse me if I'm saying the name wrong.
Well, when we watched the Russian intervention last September, it was during the UN General Assembly, we all had great hopes that by taking Russia at its word, that Russia would become a full and complete partner with us in the defeat of Daesh. We had hopes that Russia would prevail upon Bashar al-Assad to reduce the violence and reduce the barrel bombing of the innocent civilians. And we'd hoped that Russia would join us in a conversation about a political transition that would remove, in the end, Bashar al-Assad and his coterie, his inner circle, and replace it with a Syrian political outcome. Those were all our hopes. We realized none of them. When the Russians intervened, it was clearly not to fight Daesh, it was clearly to support the Assad regime. The application of Russian firepower was against anyone who bore arms against the regime, which included many of the individuals that we supported, people that were the so-called Free Syrian Army, people who were the moderate Syrians, people who had a future, theoretically, in the political process. They all got bombed. It was indiscriminate. It created a large number of casualties, but it also created a
But
huge
yet
number.
the Americans didn't do anything about it. They
No, we
still-
didn't. No, we didn't.
They still bedfellows with the Russians.
No, I wouldn't call us bedfellows with the Russians. I would simply say
Syria,
that they brought a level of military involvement into this conflict that the U.S. administration has been unwilling to commit. Now, that's in regard to the displacement of Bashar al-Assad. The coalition has remained focused on Daesh. Probably 15% maybe of the Russian airstrikes went in against Daesh, so they really weren't much help to us.
Yes.
And so to the question, was the Russian intervention helpful to dealing with Daesh? The answer is by and large no.
I think I'll take the lady here. We need a microphone, please. Oh, you have it. Right.
My name is Neelam Dev. I'm a former Indian
Can I just ask you to keep all the questions as brief as possible, because I think everybody wants to ask questions. So please.
So I lead a foreign policy think tank in Mumbai called Gateway House.
Good.
My question is that while you've been speaking about the Arab world and as well as Southeast Asia, the largest population of Muslims in the world lives in South Asia. There have been some reports of fighting between ISIS and Taliban in Afghanistan. Pakistan has its own groups of militancy, and there have been some horrific incidents. What's your assessment of ISIS in the whole region, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and of course its implications for India?
Actually had meetings with an Indian delegation not long ago in Delhi on this issue. India is unique, I think, in the region, in the context that the Muslim population in India feels much more of an affinity to being Indian than necessarily an affinity for some kind of an extremist group that might siphon off their sense of dissatisfaction. That makes India really unique, because all of the states around India, Bangladesh, for example, there is probably going to be a wilayat of Isil that it will emerge in Bangladesh. There are multiple extremist groups. If Isil isn't enough, there are multiple extremist groups in Pakistan. You're correct in saying that in Afghanistan, the Taliban and the criminal patronage networks have joined forces to fight Daesh in what's known as the wilayat of the Khorasan. China, of course, has members of the Uyghurs as fighters in ISIL as well, and we've seen them actually in the western provinces of Iraq. So the region has the potential to be a real source for recruits. To this point, there are very few Indian members, as we've been able to determine, in the ranks of Daesh, but there are significant numbers of Pakistanis, a large number of Afghans, and of course there is a province in Afghanistan and Pakistan that straddles the border. This is another reason why we have to spend very special attention, or spend very significant amount of attention, understanding what these provinces are. Because in order to deal with those, we won't be able to use the coalition that's been formed against ISIL. The political momentum of that coalition is focused really in the core area of Iraq and Syria. Pivoting something that big is very difficult on short notice. What we do anticipate is leveraging multilateral combinations of states in the region that can bring to bear pressure on that particular organization, whether it's in Dhaka, whether it's in Mindanao, whether it's Boko Haram in West Africa. We'll see a regional or a local approach to dealing with the constellation, while the coalition itself will remain focused on the core of ISIL in Iraq and Syria.
I'm going to take a question now from the iPad, and it's somebody who wants to be anonymous. And the question is,
Good.
Yeah, it's good. Yeah, it must be a serious politician. What kind of leadership would you expect from Europe in fighting Daesh in Libya?
Fighting Daesh in Libya.
Libya.
Well, I think we're seeing.
It started now for a while. It hasn't been there.
Well, there's no bad time to make a good beginning.
Yeah, and Mr. Obama
That's right.
alluded to that.
So I think we should recognize that there have been initiatives that are underway now in Europe to deal with ISIL more broadly, but also ISIL as it threatens in Libya, and we should encourage that.
Is it easier to defeat Daesh in Libya than in Syria and Iraq?
I'm not sure that you can equate the two. The order of magnitude of Daesh in Syria and Iraq is much larger.
Because there is worry that as we start to really push on them in Syria and Iraq, that they're going to go to Libya.
Well, that's a very important point, and we have had some indications in the not too distant past that this gives you, I think, an important insight into the health of the organization. There has been concern that if we see real success on the ground in the core area, Daesh leadership may have to displace, and the next place they'll go will be Libya. So it's important for us now to consider the mechanisms and the measures that we would take to try to limit the capacity of that organization. And I think we have all seen that U.S. and others are conducting both special operations and airstrikes against that organization now to try to limit its capacities.
Yes, the lady.
Thank you. General, I want to ask you about something. I think this
Where am I looking?
security sector reform, which has come from 20 years ago or something, is bringing the revolutionary on military affairs, which is impacting on our defense budget very large. The problem now in our country, Indonesia, that we cannot control this movement like ISIS or whatever.
Can you please make a very short
Okay, my question is, do we need to militarizing our military? Because I think that's the only choice that we can have to control this movement. Thank you.
Yes.
I think the answer is that in the short term, we have a lot of work to do in the security sector and in the military sector. We have to fight now because Daesh is threatening us. It's threatening our way of life. It threatens a number of our countries. It threatens our families. The solution in the short term is to attempt to increase to the extent we can the security capacity of our partner states. That's important. But also, just as important, in the longer term, we have to strengthen things like judiciaries so that we can bring justice to people. One of the frustrations that radicalizes so many people is their utter conviction that they'll never receive justice from their own state, from their own country. So one of the things that can be helpful, not necessarily in Indonesia's case, but that can be helpful, is programs that can counter corruption, programs that can strengthen judiciaries, programs that ensure that women have opportunities for education. That's extremely important, educating the women of these developing states. Programs that can give people hope for economic prosperity. Daesh is not just about fighting. Daesh is a symptom of a series of circumstances and causal factors which, left unresolved, means we'll be fighting forever. This is what we really need to do in a place like Indonesia or other countries, not just deal with the security dimension. Let's deal with some of the underlying causes to strengthen the state, to give it better capacity for governance, so that the people that might be radicalized and join Daesh no longer feel the need to be radicalized. And that's the aspiration that we should have. This is a long-term challenge, though.
Yes. Yes, the gentleman over there.
Shlomo Avineri, Jerusalem, Israel.
Good to see you,
Gentlemen,
Professor.
You mentioned the historical dimension of the failure of governance. What we see is a number of failed states in the Middle East.
Yes.
And the question is it possible to put Humpty Dumpty together again? In other words, is it possible to create a coherent Iraqi state, a coherent Syrian state, a coherent Syrian state? And if not, what could be the strategy to confronting non-state actors that will remain on the playing for a very long time? It's a completely new, different kind of challenge.
It depends on the state. It depends on the reasons that it failed and what was left behind. Libya, of course, has two principal political groups. The question is, do they share enough in terms of the potential for a common future that they would be willing to try to create a unity government? So I can envision potentially movement there. It's going to require also that, by the way, that we defeat Daesh, because it's the principal wedge between the two. Iraq, when we began this journey with regard to Iraq, we actually had the conversation about whether we would seek to restore the territorial integrity of Iraq, because frankly, none of the states in that region would have organized themselves in 1919 that way had it been left to them. Or would we look for another form of organization? And I think in the case of Iraq, I know we chose to take measures to restore the territorial integrity, to stabilize the government in Baghdad so it could extend sovereignty over the state. Now, we got issues with the Sunni leadership. It's by and large out of the country. We got many challenges, but I can see the restoration of the conditions in Iraq. And should elements within the Iraqi population seek a different political relationship with Baghdad, that's, I think, the next chapter.
10 minutes to go, General.
Okay, let me, but
Yeah,
the professor's made a very good point.
Yes.
I don't know about Syria. I just don't. I'd love to think that there could be, as we all aspire, a day, someday, when Syria is a unified, secular, democratic state. You know, those are easy to say, hard to do. I, in the short term, don't see the unification of Syria for years. And I think that's going to be a challenge for us. Yemen is in a similar boat, frankly.
Yes, so sorry, General. It's just that we only have 10 minutes, and I know. Please, could you be as brief as possible?
And I will as well.
Thank you, General. Thank you. It's
yes,
so precious what you're telling us, so I don't dare to tell you to be brief, but in the circumstances,
I'm
yes.
Konstantin Agets from Moscow, actually. One brief remark, you telling us that President Obama for a second believed that President Putin is going to help him oust Assad is probably as scary as Daesh.
Thank you for
my
that.
question.
For that comment.
My question is a bit outlandish, probably. What do you think militarily could be done to eliminate Daesh? Would Iraq too, if I may, work? Boots on the ground.
Well, you know, that's an important question. We wrestle with that all the time. To the important question that the lady from the Emirates asked, and she's gone. She made a very important point. And what we learned was if you put 150,000 Westerners on the ground in the Middle East, it creates huge antibodies. It really, in many respects, has the second and third order effect of destabilizing the social fabric. We actually went through that conversation as we were planning to deal with Daesh. Do we want to put American boots on the ground and take Daesh on frontally? And you know, we know how to do this at this point. After 14 years, we got this down. We know how to do this. And, but the reality, though, the reality is, at the end of that, what do? We had 100,000 troops on the ground in Iraq for 8 years fighting something much less capable than al-Qaeda, and 5,000 dead. Now, what do? Is it better for us to go in as a Western force, because it wouldn't have been just us probably, and fight them head up in a big conventional maneuver battle, only to find that we're stuck in an occupation again? Or is it better for us to do what we can to build capacity with the Iraqis and eventually with the Syrians to beat Daesh so that the indigenous regional population is not only the defeat mechanism, but it's also the factor that stabilizes the population that has been rescued from Daesh? It's not as pretty, frankly. It takes longer. It's probably more resource intensive. But in the end, when the fighting is over, the fighting is over. And we don't end up having to deal with the removal of 150,000 foreign troops that once again, in an area today which is enormously delicate, badly destabilized, failed states, as the professor mentioned, many states that are failing are on the edge. I think that while this probably has not satisfied many who would like to have seen a large American ground incursion, I think this process is going to unfold the direction we want to. It'll just take longer, and it won't be as pretty.
I thought the Russians were doing this for us in Syria, at least. Yeah. I have to take one from the GLOBSEC iPad, and the question is from Kirsten Friss. As the relative power of the U.S. in the world is decreasing, are you fearing an overstretch to promise more than can be delivered in the struggle? My guess is no.
Yeah, I'm not sure of the question. I'm not sure I, first of all, agree with the premise. What I would say is,
Well, the premise is the U.S. overstretched. Or
Yeah, well, look, the U.S. is dealing with really three major global constituencies. The first is our partners in Europe. NATO is absolutely essential to the future, not just of Europe, but to the future of the Atlantic Alliance and the future of the United States. It's essential, and I hope people are listening to that back home.
Mr. Trump is.
Well, you know, who knows? But I hope we're all
say it.
listening. NATO is essential. And the United States has military obligations here, and we're actually increasing them now because of the challenges we're facing in the region. But the Middle East is also essential to the United States. And this theory that as the U.S. becomes energy independent, that the Middle East becomes unimportant in the United States, that's not true, because many of our most important partners rely on that energy as well. And so our Arab allies and Arab partners who are very precious to the United States, they still remain very important to us. So we have a military presence there. We also have 5 defense treaties in East Asia. South Korea, Japan, Thailand, the Philippines, and Australia. Those are go-to-war treaties to defend those countries. We have a military obligation to be there as well.
That's why you're the most powerful nation on earth.
Well, and you get stretched a bit. And so if we talk about pulling forces out of the Middle East to go to Europe, or go rather to East Asia, our partners in the Middle East rightly are very worried about that.
Sure.
If we say we'll keep our force level standard in the Middle East or static in the Middle East, but we'll take them from Europe, our NATO partners are going to be very concerned about that. So I would not say that the U.S. is in decline. I would say that the U.S. is increasingly stretched because the enormity of the challenges are global now, where they were more regional before. And of course, we've had a different view, I think, for the last few years on the role of American leadership. That may or may not persist after the
That's
next
a big
election.
question
We'll
too.
see. Yep.
I'm going to try and take another 2 questions because we have about 4 minutes. The gentleman there who has been very patient.
Thank you very much. General, my name is Rastam Muhammad Isa. I'm from ISIS, Malaysia, the Institute of Strategic and International Studies.
Oh no!
I knew exactly where you were from. That's why I was getting ready to run off the stage.
Change your name.
I just had to say that. But we've been in existence since 1983.
You have our attention, sir.
General, you talked about the messaging centers.
Yeah,
Now, obviously, increasingly the fight is in cyberspace.
that's right.
Together with on the ground and elsewhere.
right.
So can you expand a little bit more about these messaging centers? Certainly not, they are not sufficient just in Malaysia and the UAE. You need them more around the world.
No, they are hubs, really. And the intent would be to create regional hubs that help in the dissemination of messages. When you counter, the strategy behind countering ISIL's narrative, Daesh's narrative, is to first attack its narrative, second, very importantly, deploy a strong counter-narrative. In other words, the reality of Islam, the sense of the strength of the family within the Muslim community, the Ummah, a counter-narrative that can compete with Daesh's narrative. So it's the countering the narrative, an alternative narrative, and then the third is mastering the platform. We have to, as your question implies, we have to contest the information space with Daesh. We can simply not leave it for them because in the end, my view is it'll be in the information space where we will find the decisive battle space in this conflict. Not the physical space, not the financial space. When we have contested and defeated Daesh's idea in the information space, then we will have been successful.
We have like 3 minutes, and I want to try and get more than 3 people. Can you please be as brief as possible?
Okay, Alexei Khudzenko, Ukrainian war correspondent. General Alan, I think all terrorist organizations in the world are related. So what can you say about pro-Russian or Russian terroristic forces on the east of Ukraine? Thanks.
I would probably not agree with the premise of your question. The outcome of terrorism, which is sort of violent propaganda, I think that's all about the same. But the reasons for which people become terrorists vary dramatically. And I would say that what we face with Daesh, what we face with Al-Qaeda, the reasons that those organizations exist are probably different reasons than what we have seen emerge in eastern Ukraine.
Chris Murphy, U.S. Senator from Connecticut. Good to
Sir,
see you.
good to
General.
see you, Senator.
Good to
How are
see
you, sir?
I just wanted to follow up on John's question about how do we deal with our GCC allies with the Saudis. We received testimony in the Foreign Relations Committee last week that many of ISIS's recruiting materials mirror those produced by the Wahhabi movement. How do we talk about the influence of an intolerant brand of Islam that in some ways forms the building blocks of this terrorist movement? It's an uncomfortable conversation for many of us to have, but an essential one.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's a problem. The export of that system of jurisprudence has been a challenge for many countries. Indonesia, for example, finds that some of its education has been funded in that regard. And that intolerance has created, if you will, hotbeds of radicalization. And I believe that part of our strategy has got to be to work with our partners, in particular with Saudi Arabia, on the realities of this. In many respects, of course, what you get when you create this widespread sense of intolerance is you build Frankenstein's monster that will eventually come for you. So I think we have to realize that, and it has become a growing concern for us. In fact, the similarity between Wahhabism in some respects and the doctrine that we've seen with Daesh. They're not the same. I'm not proposing that they're the same, but there are similarities. And I think we have to be very conscious of the reality that the more we export that, the more radicalization we may find in areas where there is weak governance and weak opportunities to extend the writ of government. And increasingly, as I've been watching this over the last couple of years, increasingly the U.S. government, I think, is moving in the right direction in terms of confronting our Saudi partners on this issue. We have to, frankly.
We need to thank the General now. I'm really sorry we're out of time. Please ask the General, grab him, and I'm sure he would like to answer your questions outside. There will also be refreshments outside. Okay, thank you.
Great, thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you
Thanks
so
a lot.
much.
My pleasure.